Today, 8th August 2023, we're now well into the Ukrainian offensive and the third month, I should say, of the Ukrainian offensive. And I will start with a quick summary of the situation on the battlefronts. Now, in my previous video, I said that there'd been some reports that the Russians had launched some kind of counterattack in the Rabotino area, that this made very little sense to me, and I didn't quite understand what exactly these reports amounted to. But over the course of the day, it became a little clearer what had actually happened. It seemed that the Russians had pushed forward from Rabotino, or at least advanced from Rabotino. I doubt in the face of any serious resistance, and reoccupied some trenches and fortifications that they had previously occupied earlier over the course of the offensive, and which had essentially passed into the grey zone. We're talking about an advance, I'm guessing, of a few 100 meters, no more than that. It's basically reoccupation of a part of the battlefield north of Rabotino. In the event, a few hours later, Ukraine began another attack on Rabotino, on the Russian positions near this village of Rabotino, south of Orekhov, this village which Ukraine has been trying to capture ever since the start of June, in order to finally reach these great Russian fortified lines, the Surovikin line, to push on beyond the Surovikin line, to capture the heavily fortified town of Tokmak further south, and then to push on from Tokmak towards the equally heavily fortified town of Melitopol, and then to push on from Melitopol to the Sea of Azov. That, let us remind ourselves, was the original Ukrainian offensive plan. It was going to break through to the Sea of Azov via Tokmak and Melitopol, and that as a result of that attack, as a result of that offensive, the Russian land bridge to Crimea would be severed. That was the original plan. Well, as I've discussed many times now, the Ukrainians have got nowhere close, at least not in this part of the front line, to even the Surovikin line. They've not managed to even capture the village of Rabotino, which is to the north of the Surovikin line. They've never reached Tokmak, and of course they haven't reached Melitopol either. Anyway, Ukraine has been trying to capture Rabotino, as I said, for the better part of 2 months now. And after this small Russian advance north of Rabotino, the Ukrainians tried again. And this attack seems to have been, again, largely an infantry attack. Large numbers of infantry. I'm going to avoid saying waves of infantry. As I understand it, these forces, these Ukrainian infantrymen, they move in small dispersed groups across the steppe land, trying to avoid the mines, trying to dodge the Russian artillery, and they rush towards the Russian positions, the Russian trenches, and of course they face heavy odds in doing so. Now, in one of his programs, Brian Beletic actually discussed, in fact, I think he's discussed this more than once, the particular tactic that the Ukrainians are trying to use. And it stems from a US analysis made some years ago of the so-called Russian Battalion Tactical Group. This is the building block formation of the Russian Field Army. It's a battalion which is heavy in armored vehicles and in tanks, but especially in artillery. By comparison with Western formations, it is rather light in infantry, but it has immense firepower. And the United States has been considering for a long time how the battalion tactical group, which has much greater firepower than analogously sized US military formations, can be overrun. And they came up with this plan that the way to defeat the battalion tactical group was to rush its positions, and rush its positions to some extent with infantry, this being a lightly having fewer infantry perhaps relative to the armoured vehicles and guns than equivalent Western formations. The hope is that you can storm its positions before all the guns and machine guns and tanks all go into action. So this is in effect the tactic that Ukraine is using. Not combined arms tactics, but another tactic which perhaps has its origins in the United States. So this is the idea, again, advance across the steppes in small groups, but in large numbers, move forward in a rush, storm the Russian positions, occupy the Russian trenches, and hope that way to achieve a breakthrough. And this attack, or perhaps I should say these attacks on Kharkov towards Rabotino, apparently started over the course of the night. They continued through much of the morning. They apparently briefly occupied a few buildings that form part of Rabotino, but like every other attack of this kind, it was ultimately unsuccessful. The Ukrainians were thrown back to their start lines. They weren't able to capture Rabotino. They didn't achieve the breakthrough, and I suspect yet again the Ukrainian losses in this kind of attack have been horrendous. Now, I'm going to say that this is, in my opinion, an outdated strategy. I mean, putting aside the wisdom of trying to advance quickly, even on foot, even in dispersed groups, over heavily mined fields, but look into that. It probably isn't the case any longer that the battalion tactical groups, if that's how the Russian units still operate, on this part of the front line are short of infantry. The Russians themselves, following the fighting last autumn, when Ukraine made rapid advances in Kharkov region, at a time when Kharkov region was largely unoccupied by the Russian military. Anyway, they seem to have concluded that they did have insufficient infantry. They needed more infantry to bulk out the battalion tactical groups. And that was partly what the purpose of that big call-up of reservists that took place in the autumn of last year was all about. So I suspect that there's an awful lot more infantry now, Russian infantry now, operating on the Russian lines than was the case last year, in the fighting last year. And by the way, that may explain why in some of the forested areas, especially on the northern front lines, where last year Ukraine had a clear advantage in forest fighting with larger numbers of infantry than the Russians had. This time, the balance has shifted, and it's the Russians who seem to be making the greater progress in the forests. It's because they have more infantry than they did last year, and infantry obviously are better able to work their way through the forests. Anyway, without getting into too much details, which I'm not the best person to explain, it does seem as if the attack on Rabotino, this latest attack on Rabotino, was a failure. And I would say something else, which is that, of course, if there is an attack of this nature, an attempt to storm Russian positions at a rush in the face of far superior Russian firepower. Then, of course, if the attack miscarries, if it fails, casualties, almost by definition, are going to be horrendous, as the Ukrainian troops are shelled and machine gunned on the approach, and as they're shelled and machine gunned as they retreat. So another very costly failure in Rabotino. The Ukrainian obsession with Rabotino, the way in which the Ukrainians seem unable to give up on this objective of trying to break through to Tokmak, even though it's becoming increasingly unlikely that this attack, this advance towards Tokmak, can succeed, speaks, in my opinion, of increasing inability on the part of Ukraine to adjust its strategy in the face of the battlefield realities. Anyway, that was what happened near Rabotino. There was also another intense Ukrainian attack yesterday, and this was in the Vremevka ledge area. And here we have had a detailed description of what happened from Alexander Khodorkovsky, a Russian militia commander, a Donbass militia commander, who has provided, he's the commander of the Vostok Battalion, one of the most elite units in the Donbass militia. He has provided us with a blow-by-blow account of what's happened in this attack on the Vremevka ledge area, and the fighting centered on an attempt by Ukraine to capture a village called Urozhainoye. Now, Urozhainoye is a village which lies a certain distance from Staromayorsk, that village which Ukraine tried to capture, fought to capture so intensively over the previous weeks. Around 10 days ago, Ukraine claimed that it had captured it. In fact, it seems to be deserted, unoccupied by both militaries. Both the Russian and the Ukrainian military are able to fire on enemy troops that occupy this village, so it is largely deserted. But it's acknowledged by both sides that the fact that the Russians have been pushed out of Staromayorsk makes this other village of Urozhainoye more vulnerable. Anyway, Ukraine attempted an attack to capture this village of Urozhainoye. And this is what Alexander Khodorkovsky has to say about how that battle went. And I should say, I'm taking this report from Slavyangrad, but it is undoubtedly Khodorkovsky's own words. He writes a very interesting and informative blog describing what is going on the battlefronts. And he says this: so far the enemy, and of course he means the Ukrainians, it is not doing very well on Urozhainoye. We looked down a little, figuring out where ours were and where they were, but then we mobilized and forced the enemy to run. Some ran into the minefield, some began to lead the wounded and take their legs back to where they came from. But the persistence with which the enemy climbs into the village can be envied. Most likely he will not calm down and continue to attack, but today we laid siege to his ardor. The fighters of the battalion commander with the call sign Lee showed themselves well. They did not lose their presence of mind and overturned the enemy in a direct collision. So what Khodorkovsky is saying is that, again, Ukraine attempted to storm this village, Urozhainoye. The fighting there was extremely intense, but the Ukrainians failed to break through. They were pushed back. The battalion, the Russian battalion that was defending this village drove the Ukrainians back, and the Ukrainians suffered heavy losses. Now, there's a number of things to say about the fighting in this particular area. First is that, again, Urozhainoye, like Staromayorsk, like all the places on the Vremevka ledge, is well to the north and west of the Surovikin line, the big defenses that make up the Surovikin line. In this area also, Ukraine has not been able to reach the major Russian fortified lines. I have heard that if Urozhainoye is captured, then for the first time over the course of this offensive, the Ukrainians will be coming close, within perhaps shelling distance of the Surovikin line. But they haven't managed to capture Urozhainoye at the moment. Now, there is a school of thought that the Russians do not intend to hold on to Urozhainoye for very much longer, that they expect to retain the control of this village for at most a week or two, and that they are ultimately preparing their retreat to the much, much stronger defences further south. I am not in any position to discuss or comment about that, but again, it's important to say that Urozhainoye is not a decisive, a key point in this battle. If Ukraine captures it, it will not mean that its offensive is succeeding. All it will mean is that Ukraine has captured another empty village. But anyway, that is one possible interpretation of the fighting there. But in any event, Ukraine has not actually even reached the major Russian fortifications in this area. Now, the other thing that I should say is that there's been a very interesting article which I should explain. I have taken from a list of articles which has been circulated by the historian Jeff Roberts. Anyway, an article by David Axe in Forbes, who has been looking at who has been conducting this fighting in Staromayorsk and on the Vremevka ledge over the last few weeks. And it turns out that it is Ukraine's entire Marine Brigade force, 4 Marine brigades. And Ukraine has concentrated 4 of these brigades into a 10-mile sector. In other words, 4 of Ukraine's most elite brigades, some of its best troops, are concentrated in this narrow, small area of the Vremevka ledge, where they've been trying for weeks now, at the cost of very high losses, to achieve a breakthrough. There are no other Marine brigades in the Ukrainian army apart from these. Now, they're called Marine brigades, and they were once connected with the Ukrainian Navy, which has to all intents and purposes ceased to exist. They are no longer used for amphibious operations anymore. They are used instead as infantry, elite infantry on the battlefronts, and specifically on this one battlefront, which is the Vremevka ledge area. And David Axe has expressed concern about this because he says that these troops, these brigades, are suffering very heavy attrition in this very, very difficult fighting. They are not going to be able to sustain this attrition for very much longer. Ukraine is burning through these 4 brigades, trying to capture small villages like Staromayorsk and now Urozhainoye. And once these brigades are basically shattered and have to be pulled back, there aren't elite troops of comparable quality to replace them, and that in itself may cause severe problems for Ukraine going forward. I thought was an interesting take, and it again illustrates some of the problems in the fighting that Ukraine is having. It's having to use its best, some of its best infantry to capture small villages in weeks of fighting, and it's only making very, very slow progress in the face of intense Russian resistance. So that's the situation on the Vremevka ledge. Now, early this morning, there were a series of reports that the Ukrainians had tried another landing on the east bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region, and there were some suggestions that the Ukrainians have managed to establish some kind of troop positions on the in this area on the east bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region, in a place called the Cossack Villages, which is a small area, a relatively small area, close to the east bank of the Dnieper. Now, there have been contradictory reports about what's actually been happening in this part of the fighting area, but we've now had a number of reports from Russian officials, and specifically from the acting governor of Russian-controlled Kherson region, and he is this is Mr. Sladko, by my recollection. Anyway, Sladko is now saying that the Ukrainians did launch these attacks, but that the attacks have failed, and that the Vladimir Saldo, and that the attacks have been the attempt to land troops on the east bank of the Kherson region have been unsuccessful. And he said this: at night, the Ukrainian forces tried to send a landing party in 2 boats to the left bank of the Dnieper near the village of Kazachi Lageria. The troops of the Dnieper army group destroyed the boats when they tried to approach the bank. Some militants, he means Ukrainian soldiers, tried to swim back to the right bank, but no one made it under heavy artillery and small arms fire. The attempted landing has been foiled. There are no enemy fighters in the area. The left bank is under the reliable protection of Russian troops. Anyone who tries to land will be eliminated. Now, that's what Saldo says. There's some reports which dispute this and say that there are still some Ukrainian troops on the east bank. It doesn't look as if there are many, and it looks as if this latest attempt to conduct an incursion over the Dnieper and to land and establish positions on the east bank hasn't been successful either. So, not much success in Kherson region. And lastly, there's been more reports of more Ukrainian attacks in the Bakhmut area. Now, here, over the last couple of days, the Russians have had the initiative. They've been pushing the Ukrainians back in places like Klesheyevka, Kurtyumovka, and the rest. But over the course of the last 24 hours, there was another big Ukrainian attack, this time towards Solidar. Again, very sketchy information, but the general consensus appears to be that it was repelled, and Klesheyevka itself, further south, continues to be under Russian control. Now, that's the situation with Ukraine's offensive in terms of territorial gains. No progress made. Ukraine still stuck. And by the way, I have just seen some extraordinary claims about the kind of fighting that is going on. And I read in an American media report, I'm sorry to say I can't remember which one, that over the course of 1 week's fighting, the Russian military is supposed to have fired 500,000 shells. 500,000 shells over the course of a single week? That seems extraordinary. I'm sure that is wrong. If it is true, I presume it includes mortar shells as well as heavy guns and probably rockets from multiple launch rocket systems. It's probably more an anecdotal description of the intensity of Russian artillery fire. But nonetheless, it gives us a good sense of what the Ukrainians feel that they're experiencing as they come up against these powerful Russian defenses. Now, the Russian authorities are now making more claims of more advances on the northern front lines. It's clear that for the moment, all the big advances are being made by the Russian military, not by Ukraine's military. And yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry made a series of claims about the advances in the north. They claimed that they'd advanced 3 kilometers over a 13-kilometer front. So that's quite a wide front, which has been pushed forward. A couple of days ago, 2 days ago, they claimed that they'd captured a village called Novosyolovskoye. And today I saw reports, not yet confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry, but by Russian reporters on the ground, that a settlement called Olshana in Kharkov region, which is said to be very close to Kupiansk, has now also been captured by the Russians. Well, again, I can't confirm whether or not this is true. Sometimes these reports of particular places being captured by the Russians turn out to be premature. Sometimes they're simply dead wrong. I still remember how back in, I think it was July of last year, there were repeated reports that the Russians had captured the town of Seversk in this area in northern Donetsk region. There were also reports in October that the Russians had captured the town of Marinka near Donetsk city. Neither of those reports was true in any shape or form. Fighting for Seversk and Marinka continues to this day. But perhaps it is true that Olshana has been captured. Why, after all, claim that this probably rather small and unimportant place has been captured if it has not been? But the sum total of all of this is that the Russians are continuing to advance in the north. They're advancing on a broad front, and they're pushing hard towards Kupiansk. And it does seem that Olshana, if it has indeed been captured, points to a Russian advance towards Kupiansk. So this is important. It's interesting that the Russians are choosing to advance on a broad front. They're not launching narrow advances over tens of kilometers. They seem to prefer to launch wide advances that perhaps proceed a couple of kilometers at a time. I suspect that they're worried to protect their flanks, which could be a sign, by the way, confirming my belief that maybe there are not vast numbers of Russian troops in this area. But one way or the other, it does point to a further Russian advance towards Kupiansk, And it looks increasingly to me as if Kupiansk is indeed in the Russians' sights, that they do intend eventually to capture this town, probably before the autumn rains. And of course, as I've said, if they do capture Kupiansk, and if it remains the case when they do capture Kupiansk, that Ukraine has gained no territory elsewhere in the battlefronts as part of its own offensive, then we are going to be in a situation where the failure of the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive, is no longer capable of being denied, whether in Ukraine or in the West. It will become clear that it is Ukraine which is retreating and that it is Russia, on the contrary, which is advancing. Anyway, I've speculated, I've suggested that the end of August, for all practical purposes, is the end point of this offensive. Ukraine might be able to eke out more attacks and advances over the course of September. But the forces that it can commit to that might become increasingly limited. Ukraine has again complained today that it is short of weapons. It says that it needs far more ammunition, far more artillery. It again demands F-16 fighters. The last is a hopeless claim, because F-16 fighters, even if they were, there was a commitment to supply them today. Well, Ukrainian pilots are still not trained to fly them. The Ukrainian air bases are still not prepared to receive them. The F-16 really has no meaning for this particular battle. But anyway, Ukraine is again complaining that it is running out of weapons, that its stocks of weapons are apparently almost exhausted. There have been complaints to that effect. It's urgently in need of weapons, or so it says. And of course, it's now pressing very hard for these Taurus long-range missiles to be supplied by Germany. Taurus being, of course, the German equivalent of the Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles that have been supplied to Ukraine by Britain and France. And the German government, Chancellor Scholz, have played their usual intricate, and I'm going to say it, duplicitous game with the German people. They've been pretending that they're not going to supply Taurus missiles, that this isn't on the agenda at all. We had statements from people like the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, saying that, no, this isn't part of our intention. We don't intend to supply Taurus missiles. And over the last few hours, even as these denials continue to be made, reports are circulating that the German cabinet has now agreed to supply Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Now, I said these are very similar in most respects to the British Storm Shadows and the French Scalp missiles. They're also subsonic, and they operate close to the ground. I understand that they are somewhat slower than the British and French missiles. British and French missiles, the Storm Shadow and the Scalp, are very high subsonic. The Taurus missiles are closer to being simply subsonic. But against that, the Taurus missile makes up for its lower speed with longer range. And the Storm Shadow has a range of about 300 kilometers. The Taurus has a range of about 500 kilometers, which would, in theory, enable Ukraine, if it's supplied with Taurus missiles, to conduct deeper strikes, more long-range strikes, deeper behind Russian defenses in places like Crimea and such places. Well, I'm sure that these missiles will be supplied. I'm sure also that the Russians expect them to be supplied. I'm sure that the Russians are taking the necessary steps to defend their positions once these missiles appear on the scene. And we've seen what those are. They've steadily, incrementally hardened their air defenses. They proved very successful in shooting down Storm Shadow missiles, and soon I'm sure they will be equally successful in shooting down the very similar Scalp missiles. And I suspect they will be equally or perhaps even more successful in shooting down the Taurus missiles, which perhaps are slower and thus easier to shoot down. But anyway, that's what we see. It's typical of Scholz. I suspect people in Germany are becoming tired of this game. Reports are that the AfD, which is now increasingly positioning itself as an anti-war party in Germany, it's now at polling around 23%. It's rising in the polls. Chancellor Scholz's party, the SPD, which within my recent memory would typically poll in elections around 40% of the vote. It's, by the way, also the oldest party in Germany, with a history going back to the late 19th century. It was once the party of Karl Marx, by the way, fact which most people don't know, and until the 1950s was an avowedly Marxist party. It was the party to which people like Karl Liebknecht, in fact, Liebknecht father and son, used to belong, and of course it was also the party of people like Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt and Gerhard Schröder. This party with this extraordinary history seems to be dwindling away. It's now at 17%. It's convincingly outpolled by the AfD at 23%. And the other parties in the German coalition, well, the FDP, the Liberal Party, which is the third party in the German coalition, on present polling, is probably going to poll less than 5% in a German election, be unlikely to gain representation in the Bundestag, the German parliament, the lower house of the German parliament. The Greens, the most militant party, pro-war party in Germany, are stable at 14%. They probably represent the hardline, anti-Russian bloc within Germany, but they're not growing. And one gets the sense, anyway, that public opinion is becoming increasingly restless in Germany. The economic situation is deteriorating. The war is dragging on. Scholz increasingly, as I said, plays these intricate, duplicitous games with the German people. And I suspect that patience with him is starting to wear thin. But anyway, for the time being, he continues to do what he's doing, and we will no doubt see the Taurus missiles eventually appear, and they will be absolutely as ineffectual as the Leopard tanks were, and the Marders, and all of those other things that Germany has supplied to Ukraine. Anyway, that's where we are with the military things. But anyway, coming back to my point that August, the end of August, is probably, realistically, the end point of at least the active part of this offensive. There's now another one of these very tantalizing reports from the Ukrainian channel, which suggests that the Ukrainians also think this. I've discussed that there's been previous reports from Zaluzhny, who says the same thing, which say the same thing, about General Zaluzhny having said the same thing to Zelensky himself. But anyway, there's a report from a Ukrainian channel called Resident, which is a Telegram channel, and it reads as follows, and again I'm taking this translation from Slavyangrad. Our source in the office of the president, that's Zelensky's office, said that the Tarnavsky, that's General Tarnavsky, who is one of the senior commanders of the Ukrainian military. He's in charge of the territorial brigades. These are the, if you like, the reservists who've been called up. They're lightly equipped. They're not the most effective parts of the Ukrainian army. Anyway, our source in the office of the president said that Tarnavsky at headquarters entered into a discussion with Zaluzhny, who opposes the second stage of the counteroffensive. The commander of the operational forces, Tavria, I presume that's another general, said that the armed forces of Ukraine had a month left to implement the D-Day operation. I presume that's the offensive, but it could also specifically mean the attempt to cross the Dnieper in force into Kherson region, which allegedly is what the United States is insisting that Ukraine now try to do. Anyway, Tavria said that the armed forces of Ukraine had a month left to implement the D-Day operation, after which it would rain and Ukraine would be forced to use only frontal attacks in the Zaporozhye direction, which would have to be curtailed in October. Time is now playing against the armed forces of Ukraine, as the rains will begin in the fall and any active operations on the southern front will stop, and this will mean the failure of the counteroffensive. So, according to this particular Telegram channel, which has proved to be well informed in the past, but which is perhaps not entirely reliable, and which I suspect might be connected to General Zaluzhny, Ukraine is running out of time. They have a month to achieve something. In other words, the end of August, perhaps the first week or two of September. Beyond that point, the weather will become impossible. The Rasputitsa will close in. Stocks of weapons and men will become exhausted. And at that point, Ukraine will be forced into an admission that the offensive has failed. Well, that's a Ukrainian channel saying this. Of course, we don't know how reliable it is. I'm going to finish this summary discussion of the fighting with two quick further observations. The first is that, just to remind, a couple of days ago, about 2 days ago, the Russian Defense Ministry, at the conclusion of the 2-month period of Ukraine's offensive, published a claim that 42,000 Ukrainian troops had been killed over the course of this offensive. And the Russians made it very clear that these were troops who had been killed, not killed and wounded. So that was a pretty extraordinary claim. I'm not able to corroborate it. It seems to me to be higher than previous Russian claims, but perhaps it might be true. Anyway, what I would say about that is that if that is true, if Ukraine has indeed lost 42,000 men killed over the first 2 months of the offensive, or let's be perhaps a little more realistic and say that the Russians are overstating things, but they might have lost 40,000 men killed and wounded over the course of this offensive, which is, it seems to me, a more plausible figure. Well, if that is true, then Ukraine has lost over the course of these 2 months, more men than the Western powers trained for the offensive. We're told that the West specifically trained 9 brigades, equipped those brigades with Western weapons to form the Spearhead Corps, the 9th Corps, to break through Russian defences. And we've now been given figures for the total number of troops in these 9 brigades, 36,000, 4,000 men per brigade. And when Russians tell us that total Ukrainian losses are 42,000, which is more than that number. Now, we don't know how the Russians calculate these figures. We don't know which brigades have taken the heaviest losses. We are getting reports, and they're appearing increasingly in parts of the Western media as well, that some of the original 9 brigades trained by the West have been extremely badly damaged in the fighting. One of them has had to be pulled out entirely because it's basically been smashed to pieces, that brigades are being lumped together, and that troops are having to be, reservists are having to be brought in to make up the numbers in these brigades, which are diluting their supposed quality. And I've even seen one report that mostly now the people in these brigades, or at least in some of these brigades, who are left and who still have the Western training are those in executive positions, the officers and the non-commissioned officers. The line infantry trained by the West are either dead or wounded or captured. At any rate, they're no longer participating in the battle. Now, that's disastrous by any measure, and it gives us again a sense of how badly wrong this offensive is going. Now, I would say that there's been some people who've been taking satellite pictures of Ukrainian cemeteries, noting the rate of their expansion, are coming up with astonishing figures for total numbers of Ukrainian deaths. I've seen one figure of 400,000 being floated around. I've no way of knowing whether that is true or not. I doubt it, actually. I would say, though, and this is just by way of caution, that the BBC Media Zona calculations on Russian losses, which I consider to be by far the most reliable because they do track confirmed Russian losses, seem to use, well, a much more sophisticated method of this same methodology, looking at obituary notices, looking at funerals, counting all of these up, reading articles in the media, and these BBC Media Zona figures seem to me to be probably accurate, reasonably accurate in giving us a ballpark picture of Russian losses. Looking at the size of Ukrainian cemeteries, the number of soldiers buried, reports in Ukraine about the deaths of soldiers, is probably as good as any way of corroborating or refuting Russian figures. And those who are trying to do that are coming up with some pretty horrendous numbers. I think we need to take all of this with a great dose of caution. And some of these figures do seem to me to be much too high. But there is no doubt at all that losses by the Ukrainian military over the course of this offensive are proving to be extremely heavy. I mean, heavy beyond all reason. And it does cause me dismay that there are people who continue to demand that the offensive be continued nonetheless. Anyway, there we are. That is the situation on the battlefronts as of today. Russian advances in the north, again, same story. Ukraine unable to advance in its own offensive areas where it's trying to conduct an offensive, but nonetheless, apparently still pushing forward, still trying to make advances, and perhaps contemplating the very complex and difficult operation of an amphibious landing across the Dnieper. So that's the situation on the battlefronts. Now, there are, as I said already, other things going on, but before I touch on those, I'm going to touch to one related event to the Ukrainian conflict, which is a discussion between Wang and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Now, yesterday, two foreign ministers, the Chinese and Russian foreign ministers, spoke on the telephone. Now, Wang Yi, of course, is China's veteran foreign minister. He stepped down from the foreign ministry in December and was replaced by Xinjiang. And then, very mysteriously, Xinjiang, halfway through July, suddenly disappeared from the scene. And then we learnt that he'd been dismissed and Wang Yi had been reappointed. I speculated that this change in foreign ministers might suggest that Xinjiang has done something which has got him into political trouble, probably something in his personal life. There's been rumours of an affair. I don't know that any of that is true, but that still seems to me the most plausible explanation for what has been happening. It has been pointed out to me by a person who not only follows Chinese events very closely, but is Chinese, that though he's had to step down from the position of foreign minister, Xinjiang remains on China's State Council, and there's no indication that he's yet in any form of disgrace. And that could mean, by the way, that I'm wrong, in which case I accept that and acknowledge it. And it could mean that he's been forced to step down, perhaps because he's become very seriously ill. Guessing that if that had been the case, we would have had rather more detail about this. The Chinese authorities have spoken about sickness. I would have thought we'd probably have a fuller explanation of what really is the problem with him. So I'm going to stick for the moment to my view that he's made some blunder. I don't think it has any bearing on the underlying stability of the Chinese government. And by the way, I should make it also clear that I don't think that his dismissal is in any way connected with the dismissal of the chair of China's central bank. I think that the two events are completely unconnected to each other. I know that there's been some claims that the two are connected in some way, but I don't think that is the case at all. Anyway, Wang Yi is back. He has a long experience of running the Chinese Foreign Ministry. He's issued a long statement which you can read on the Chinese Foreign Ministry's website about the work of the ministry, which, by the way, gives me the further impression that he's coming back, at least in part, to steady the ship after whatever problems have affected his predecessor. But anyway, the key point is that he knows Lavrov well. The two have worked together for many years. They're apparently personal friends. So this telephone call between Wang Yi and Lavrov is a conversation between friends. And it is a very, very friendly exchange. Now, the Chinese government has not yet published an English language transcript of this conversation. But one can get a machine translation, which is what I am reading from, and which, by the way, is what I think some Western media agencies are also relying upon. I'm going to briefly read the Chinese readout, which is relatively short by Chinese standards. On August 7th, member of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China Central Committee and Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a telephone conversation with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. Wang Yi said that since President Xi Jinping's visit to Russia in March this year, the two countries have made new progress in both strategic cooperation and strategic coordination and practical cooperation. The bilateral trade volume has reached a new high, energy cooperation has been carried out steadily, and personnel exchanges have rapidly resumed. Facts have proved that China and Russia are trustworthy and reliable good friends and good partners. At present, the most important task for both sides is to continue to implement the important consensus reached by the two heads of state and promote the continuous high-level development of China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination for a new era. Okay, so that seems extremely friendly. Things are getting closer. China and Russia are getting closer. They're becoming more friendly with each other. All is well. And it continues very much along those lines. Wang Yi said that on the international and multilateral arenas, China and Russia should continue to maintain close strategic coordination, which is, of course, important. It's one of the things that the two foreign ministers must do to work with each other. And it goes on to say, promote the process of multipolarization of the world, the democratization of international relations, and safeguard the basic norms of international relations. This is the proper meaning of strategic partnership. The BRICS mechanism keeps up with the trend of the times and shows full vitality. More than 20 countries have expressed their desire to join, and the expansion process is inevitable. China is willing to work with BRICS partners, including Russia, to jointly support South Africa in successfully hosting the upcoming BRICS leaders meeting so as to promote the healthy and vigorous development of the BRICS mechanism. So, again, very friendly cooperation between China and Russia to develop and build up the BRICS and to ensure that the forthcoming BRICS summit meeting, which of course Putin is going to attend virtually, is going to be a success. And then we hear what Lavrov is supposed to have said in response. Lavrov said that Russia is willing to work with China to implement the important outcomes of President Xi Jinping's visit to Russia in March this year, strengthen strategic coordination, deepen practical cooperation, and promote bilateral relations to continuously achieve new results. Russia is willing to continue to strengthen communication and coordination with China under multilateral frameworks such as the United Nations, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and oppose hegemony, resist unilateralism. Oppose hegemony means oppose the United States' policies, resist unilateralism, promote the process of democratization of international relations, and safeguard international fairness and justice. So, nothing here that suggests anything new between these two friends. They both agree with each other. Relations between us are good. We need to make them even better. We have lots to coordinate and cooperate about. Our trade is booming. The BRICS summit is coming. We're going to work together closely to make the BRICS summit a success. And we both agree that it's important to cut the Americans down to size, to work together to contain their activities, and to build together a multipolar world. And then comes the paragraph which some people in the West have made a big play over. The two sides also exchanged views on the Ukrainian crisis and other international and regional issues of common concern. Wang Yi emphasized that on the Ukraine crisis, China will uphold an independent and impartial stance, make an objective and rational voice, actively promote peace talks, and seek a political solution on any international multilateral occasion. Lavrov said that Russia highly agrees with China's position paper on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis and appreciates and welcomes China's constructive role in this regard. There's been an awful lot of focus on the word impartial stance because some have interpreted it as distancing China from Russia. Now, the word impartial comes, as I say, when you take the Chinese text of this readout and put it through a machine translation. It comes up with the word impartial, and I'm going to make a guess that that is what a lot of foreign news agencies have done. Now, a Chinese person who follows events in China closely and who obviously is able to read Chinese texts tells me that impartial, the word impartial, is actually slightly inaccurate. The Chinese character, which is being translated as impartial, actually has a somewhat softer meaning. A more accurate translation would be fair and just. So China will hold an independent, fair and just stance, make an objective and rational voice. Well, be that as it may, whether the words are impartial or fair and just, I don't see anything new in this. It is exactly what the Chinese have been saying all along. They've been saying exactly this ever since they outlined their position paper, which Lavrov says he highly agrees with. And I don't see any shift or move in Wang Yi's position here at all. I suspect that people have latched onto this word to give the readout an entirely different meaning, and as part of the rather fevered attempts to give a spin to the outcome of the conference in Jeddah that I notice is now taking place in sections of the Western media, which suggests that by China's mere attendance at the Jeddah conference, China was in some way distancing itself from Russia. You actually look at what Chinese officials, like Li Hui, who was the official who attended the Jeddah conference, are actually saying, that is demonstrably not true. As I discussed in my program yesterday, it's clear that countries like Saudi Arabia, China, India, Brazil went to Jeddah and said quite clearly at Jeddah that Zelensky's peace plan, which is the peace plan that this conference was supposed to discuss, that this peace plan is a non-starter. They weren't even prepared to discuss it. And the Saudis came up with a completely different plan, one which seeks an immediate ceasefire along the current line of control and an exchange of prisoners, but which ultimately appears to concede the possibility that these territories currently under Russian control will remain under Russian control, at least for the foreseeable future. Now, that this is the true outcome of the Jeddah summit is shown by certain contradictory statements that have been coming out of Ukraine. Some Ukrainian officials have expressed some pleasure at the outcome of the Jeddah summit, where, by the way, Ukraine was represented by Yermak, one of Zelensky's advisors. But another Ukrainian official, another one of Zelensky's officials, advisors, Podolyak, has now come along and said that any appearance of concessions, any appearance that Ukraine shifted its position over the course of the Jeddah summit is wrong. Ukraine continues its previous stance. It continues to insist that Zelensky's peace plan, which requires a total withdrawal of all Russian forces from all territory claimed by Ukraine as its own before negotiations can even begin, that remains Ukraine's firm and unchanging position. Now, I read this to mean that over the course of the Jeddah summit, the Saudis, the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians put great pressure on Yermak to change Ukraine's position, and Yermak, perhaps in order to get an agreement for a follow-up meeting in a month and a half's time, which seems to be the US and Ukrainian objective, he to some extent gave the impression that Ukraine might be willing to do that. When people like Podolyak and the other hardliners in Kiev found out about that, they went public and said that whatever Yermak said at Jeddah, the reality is that Ukraine's position continues unchanged, something which will certainly not be welcome in Riyadh, Beijing, Delhi, or Brasilia. Now, anyway, that's, I think, what actually happened in Jeddah. I've discussed it at length in my previous video. But as I said, there's been this intense spin to try to present what was actually a failure into a success, to pretend that some progress was made at the Jeddah summit towards agreeing to support the Zelensky plan, that the Chinese are coming on board with this idea. And as part of that spin, words have been taken out of context from this Chinese readout of this conversation between Lavrov and Wang Yi, basically to lend some reinforcement to that spin. You should always be very careful of spin operations. They are very much now a part of international diplomacy. The West does this all the time. There's constant attempts to present meetings like this as breakthrough meetings when manifestly they are not. To reiterate, I don't think there has been any change in the Chinese position ever from the moment when the conflict first began, and nor do I expect there to be. I think the Chinese and the Russians understand each other very well over this conflict, and I don't think that that is going to change. So, just wanted to say this. This is taking a little explanation, but I think a full study of this readout is necessary to get a sense of what the Chinese are really saying. And by the way, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank that person, that Chinese person who's provided me with all this information and with a proper explanation of the Chinese characters that say just and fair instead of impartial, and without whose help I would not have been able to explain this. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the Wang Yi-Lavrov meeting. Now, there has been another meeting which is important, and it's completely unrelated to events in Ukraine. And that is that the Deputy Secretary of State of the United States, Victoria Nuland, in her new role, in other words, as number 2 in the State Department, has visited Niger. And she's held what we are told were frank and difficult talks with the Nigerian military. She's to Niger and had frank and difficult talks with the Niger military. And this is taking place against continued rumors that there will be a military intervention in Niger by ECOWAS, specifically by Nigeria and Senegal, which are the two militarily strongest ECOWAS states. And at the same time, as Niger is now under intense sanctions pressure brought to bear against it both by ECOWAS and by the Western powers. Anyway, frank and difficult talks, as my colleague Alex Christoforou said in the program that we've actually done about this issue, suggests a very difficult and a failed meeting. And in my opinion, it's quite obvious what has happened. Nuland came to Niger and effectively, essentially delivered an ultimatum. She said to the Niger military, restore the civilian president, who is of course the constitutional president, to power. If you don't, you risk a military intervention. And it's clear that the Niger military said no, and they're continuing in their defiance. And I think there's now a very strong probability that some kind of military intervention will take place, probably in a couple of days' time, when the various governments in ECOWAS have been fully brought round. Apparently there's to be an ECOWAS meeting on the 10th of August to discuss what to do. So I think that there will probably be an intervention. I think Niger is too important simply to be let go of. At least that's what the Western powers think. I don't agree with that kind of calculus. But anyway, I think that's what the Western powers think. And the African states that make up ECOWAS have their own entirely separate, and by the way, legitimate reasons for not being happy about a coup overthrowing a civilian government in a neighbouring country. Now, that's what I wanted to say about this, but there is one issue I do want to clarify and discuss briefly, and that is the issue of Russian involvement. And I want to make it very clear that I don't think there is any Russian involvement in the crisis in Niger, and I don't expect there to be. Now, in my program yesterday, I expressed strong skepticism about that video which showed a Russian Ilyushin 76 freighter aircraft flying into Niger's capital. There was lots of speculation that Wagner fighters were on board. I was very doubtful about that. Well, turns out I was right to be, because in fact this film dates from 2006 and is completely unrelated to the current events in Niger. Let me say it very straightforwardly. I think the Russians not only are not behind this coup, but they have straightforwardly condemned it. They have said that they too want to see the constitutional order and the civilian authority in Niger restored. And I think that the Russians are actually, frankly, embarrassed by this whole episode. I think that they're determined to steer clear of it. They do not want to become involved. Briefly, at the time of the St. Petersburg summit, the Africa-Russia summit, Putin went out of his way to tell African leaders that he was as critical of coups d'etats as they were, and he pointed out that the current government in Ukraine is itself ultimately a product of the coup d'etat that took place in February 2014 in Ukraine. Now, given that that is so, given that he said that just about a week ago, it'd be very difficult for Putin to simply turn round and say, well, I don't support coups d'etats except for the one in Niger. I mean, that simply isn't what Putin is going to do. Beyond that, Russia has actually good relations with some of the ECOWAS states. Senegal, for example, being one. I absolutely do not think that Putin or the Russians want to complicate their relations, make their relations with the ECOWAS states difficult in any way. And I would add also, if we look at this issue of relations with African states, that the Russians have historically had, at times, quite warm relations with Nigeria, which is, of course, also a member of OPEC+. Now, it's not widely remembered today, but the Soviet Union in the 1960s played a critical role in preserving the current Nigerian state. It supplied large numbers of military equipment to the Nigerian government during the Biafra War, and I suspect that there is still some lingering legacy of this in relations between Russia and Nigeria to this day. So yes, Nigeria at the moment may have a president who's more aligned to the West, but the Russians will not want to burn their bridges with Nigeria either. So they're going to go out of their way to tell everybody that they're not involved. And there is no evidence at all of the presence of any Wagner fighters in Niger. Now, the protesters in the capital of Niger have been displaying Russian flags. The military in Niger, which is now at risk of facing a foreign intervention, is apparently asking for help from Russia and from the Wagner organization. But that does not mean that the Russians are involved, or that they're happy about these events in Niger, or that they will support the coup there. The danger that this thing could get out of hand is not because of what the Russians might do, but because other powers, African states, are not happy by the prospect of an intervention in Niger by Nigeria and Senegal. Guinea has spoken out against it. Burkina Faso has said that it would see it as a declaration of war and is apparently now mobilizing, or so the reports say. Mali opposes it also, and Algeria, which has perhaps the most powerful military in the region, has spoken out strongly against it, though it's important to say that it has stopped short of saying that it will intervene to defend Niger itself. So there is a real risk of this thing escalating into a conflict in Africa, but it is not a geopolitical conflict at the moment. Now, if, somewhat against my expectations, there is no intervention in Niger, if the coup consolidates in Niger, if a new political structure emerges out of it, which is able to establish its authority in the country, then of course things become different. Then I can imagine that at some point, if this new authority turns to Russia for economic and security assistance, the Russians might be more accommodating. But we're not at that position yet, and for the moment, as I said, the Russians will watch and wait, but I am absolutely sure, I'm confident, they will not intervene. So I just wanted to say that because I think there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty about this. My own view, to repeat again, is that the Russians were caught by surprise by these events in Niger. They don't welcome them. They're embarrassed by the attempts of the Niger authorities and some of the protesters in Niger to involve them in it. They do not want to complicate their relations with other African countries by appearing to take Niger's side, and I think that they will stay out. Anyway, that's my take on the Russian position. I just thought I would make it clear in this program. No doubt events in Niger will clarify over the next few days. So this is where I finish my program today. Just to remind everyone that all our programs can be found on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and you can also check out our shop, buy the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. Links to the platforms, to Patreon and Subscribestar, and to our shop under this video. If you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.